Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and welcome to this nice series of studies that I'm going to be doing this weekend. I want to thank Mike and the congregation here for the opportunity to develop this topic based on a trip that I took last year to Asia Minor, in which I was able to study the first century writings in context of the geography, topography, history of the first century on location. I went to Asia Minor, Western Turkey, and I was able to go to all the churches of Revelation except for one. There was really nothing there, so it's like driving 2 hours to see nothing. So, and then I went to northern Greece, area of the Macedonia, old Kingdom Macedonia. Then I went to Athens. I went to Corinth, Cenchrea, Ishmia. Thank you so much, brother. And then after that, we went to Rome. We spent we went to Corinth and Athens. And then we went to Rome. One of the things that I learned while I was there is how much I did not know about the New Testament. Okay, so when you read the New Testament or the Brit Hadashah, the first century writings, there's a big challenge that we have. Our challenge is that we are removed from its cultural environment. We don't live in that environment anymore. We are trying to understand the Bible from different lenses, specifically from the Western world. And in reality, many things that I've learned when I read it now in its context, there's a gross misunderstanding of the text by many people. Now, there's an advantage and a disadvantage, because then when you're trying to highlight these things, then they assume that you're trying to know more than them. That's not the point. The point is that I got to see it. When you see something and you validate the information, it's kind of hard for somebody to tell you that's not the case when they've never been anywhere. And what I'm trying to do is develop a curriculum or a type of studies that would allow you to tap into, right along the history, understand why things were said in the book of Acts. Right now, we only have an hour and 15 minutes. So it's an introduction. Basically, each session is an introduction to what I want to teach on, just to get you excited about maybe joining me on one of my tours to Asia Minor that will take place hopefully in November. You know, I'm going to go to Israel in May in a Spanish tour. And in November, I want to take an English Full Steps of Paul, and I want to teach there in the churches of Revelation. There's a lot to learn. We will never understand the New Testament unless we consider looking into the culture of its day. It will be practically difficult. It will be impossible. Let me give you an example. I'm going to mention topics that I deal with in my studies on the New Testament. What you have is imperial worship, imperial cult, cities that were neocortos. What does that mean? Neocortos, temple warden. You should know because it's in the book of Acts 19:36. You need to know what that meant to them in Asia Minor. It's a great position of honor. What is a image of the emperor and what they did to the image of the emperor? The 12 tablets of Rome, they living under Greco-Roman authority. So what were the 12 tablets? Also, what was criminal law of Rome? Because Paul is dealing with a lot of legal actions, legal things. What were the rights of the Jews in ancient Rome and the exemptions that the emperors gave the Jewish people so that they will have their own associations, their own guild, their own unions? Because you cannot belong to any city unless you belong to an association, to a union, which later in the book of Revelation is going to be revealed by, if you do not belong to that, you cannot buy or eat or sell. Your whole identity was on the premise that you belong to a tribe, believe it or not. And the tribe of the Jews in Rome, in Alexandria, were called the Hellenists. So they have to belong somewhere. They have to have an identity. By the way, the Jews, they were not very well liked at all in the kingdom, in the Greco-Roman world. They cannot live without them. They cannot live with them. I'm not talking about in Judea. I'm talking about in the Greco-Roman world. A whole bunch of them in Rome, a whole bunch of them in Asia Minor. The king of Greece, he actually transplanted 2,000 families. from Babylon, when the Greeks conquered the Persians, he transferred 2,000 families to Lystra, one of the provinces of eastern Turkey, which, by the way, is near Antioch or Tarsus, where Paul lived. They spoke different languages. They spoke different dialects. They had different religions than the Greeks and the Romans. All of that became syncretism and mixed in. You have patron-client relationship. What does the word grace represent to the Greco-Roman world? How about the gospel? All these were very well-known terms in the first century. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome versus the peace of God, the Pax of Christos, or the Lord. This is part of the New Testament. How about biblical law? How about, Greco-Roman law? What are the laws in regards to circumcision to the Romans? What is worshiping the emperor? How do you do it? There's so many different things that we need to consider when we read the New Testament, that when you understand the language and the motifs throughout the New Testament, then when you read the text, it's simple. You understand who the audience is, to whom it was written to, for what purpose. When you read a letter, specifically Galatians, everyone goes to Galatians, right? And they argue from Galatians. Y'all don't want to follow the Torah, they quote you Galatians. But yet, in chapter 3, the latter verses, it tells you there's neither Jew or Gentile, man or female, slave or freedman. Wait a minute, are there slave people right now here in America? No. So what is the context when it was said Paul to them in Galatia, which is modern-day Turkey? It's one of the provinces. It's not a town. Cappadocia, Bithynia, Asia, all those places were provinces of the Greco-Roman world, the Roman Empire, in Turkey, or Anatolia in the ancient world. You see, so these are things that we need to consider. So what I'm going to do, just to maximize my time, I'm going to go right to chapter 15. I'm going to start there. I'm going to give you a brief introduction as to why in the book of Acts, chapter 15. We're going to be doing a lot of reading. It's going to be like a course. Okay? So please, I pray that you understand that it took a lot of money, effort, research to just give you the intro. I just want to share it with you because I think it's important. Have you ever asked the question why Acts 15 is so important? Specifically, when you read these verses, it says, "Therefore I conclude that we should not cause difficulty to those from among the Gentiles who turn to God, but we should write a letter to them to abstain from pollution of idols, from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled and blood." The next verse is important. We use that verse to say, you see, they're keeping Sabbath or they're reading the Torah. But the thing is that within this one particular verse, it encases a whole bunch of legal matters we never considered. The Jews could not meet any other place other than the synagogue. It's called collegia. In other words, there were rules in the Greco-Roman world in which if you wanted to have freedom of religion, which you did, but you have to belong to a group. It's like you need permission to have this congregation here. Right? I mean, can you go and meet in somebody else's property and even in public places without a permit? In some places you can't. In China you can't. In some other countries you can't. So why is it that this is important? Because the Jews had exemptions. One of the emperors gave them exemption. One of the kings of Greece gave them exemptions. They were exempted from serving in the Roman army because of kosher laws and the Sabbath and the feasts. They were exempt from worshiping imperial cult. They were not bound. If you belong to the collegia or the association of the Jewish community, part of the community within Ephesus or Sardis, any of those places, then you will be able to legally be abstained from offering sacrifices to the emperor in imperial cult. You didn't have to partake of that. So if you're Greek and you're a Roman and you see the Jews having all these exemptions that they didn't have, it's going to create some kind of animosity. Now, with that being said, this is the proof that we know that any believer in the first century, they have to go to the synagogue and read the Torah and observe the laws and the Sabbath there, because legally that's the only place they can meet. So when I hear the argument, oh, there's no proof that the believers kept the Sabbath, you're not understanding Roman law. Because we have the laws of collegia. I mean, you have to understand that you have to belong to a particular group of people in order to have the exemptions. Does that make sense? That's only one example. But then we have to understand why those requirements to the Gentiles. Now, the systems of religion use these particular three things to abstain from the observance of the Torah. They say this is all we need. All we need is to do these three things. And they stay there. But the problem is that the New Testament doesn't give you an outline as to defining what idolatry is or what the improper preparation of foods. It doesn't give you that outline because that's already been given in the Torah and the prophets, specifically in the Torah. Let's go to the book of Leviticus, and you see these little tags that I have right here? That's going to be the teaching. I'm going to contrast this to when the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, so we understand really what it says. The Jerusalem Council is actually the sole authority. Now, remember, in the book, and I'm going to read a lot, so please understand that this is something that Mike asked me to do, and I think it's important that we do the teaching. Not a preaching today. It's going to be a teaching. I want you to have a grasp of what we're reading in the New Testament. When you read the New Testament in these contexts, the Torah permeates all throughout. It'll be difficult not to see the Torah being promoted in the New Testament writings. When people tell me that Paul's not teaching Torah, you're not reading the New Testament correctly. You know? Okay, so it says Ezekiel 44, verse 23 and 24 tells us about the duty of Israel, specifically the sons of Aaron, to teach them to separate the holy and profane and the clean and unclean. So the social features of a social organization contributed to the debasing of morality. Just like in the Canaanite cult in the time of the Israelites, which the same restrictions that you see in Leviticus 17 and 18 and 19 are exactly the same restrictions that you see in Acts 15, because there were the exact same problems in the first century with imperial cult, with fertility rituals, the Artemis cult and worship of Diana, and also the Aphrodite and Asclepius. All these things happened and had a huge effect in the lifestyle of everyday believer. Okay? It says, slavery gave occasion for cruelty and sexual license, punishment of criminals, notably through sentencing to the mines and execution by crucifixion, showed the brutality of the time. The gladiatorial contests and wild beast fights discussed below reflect a brutal and cruel outlook. The Roman policy of bread and games to keep the populace content prevented initiative and emphasized sensual satisfaction. So, for example, in the Greco-Roman world, homosexuality was very weird the way they defined it. Now, Paul, it goes right to the point. No, it's a sin. He's telling the people what is not socially acceptable in the Greco-Roman setting if you are a believer in Yeshua. If you're a Gentile coming into the believing in Yeshua, you're not to behave like the Greeks. For example, and I don't mean to be graphic, but the book of Leviticus talks about this. You know, it restricts all of the prohibitions of sexual behavior. In the Greco-Roman world, they believed the love of a man was greater than the love of a woman. The woman served just to provide children because that meant honor for the father. Then you have the paterfamilias. The paterfamilia was the head of the family. The ultimate head of the family was the emperor. He had the sole authority given to him by the Senate to determine life and death. Okay? But the paterfamilia, each family, each clan had a father of the house. Like in Hebrew, it's Bet-Av. It's like Abraham, he was a father of the clan. And then Jacob, and then so on and so forth. Okay? So therefore, now the paterfamilia had complete control of the family. He can determine if a child, when it's born, whether he's going to adopt him into the family. It's his child, or a child in the clan. So they will take the baby and they put it at the feet of the father of the house. And if the father of the house picked him up and raised him up, named him, then he is a legit citizen. But if he turned his back to that child, then they will throw him out for the dogs and let him die. That's the way that it worked. So a man, if he's married, if he's a Roman citizen, if he goes out there and he commits homosexuality in our understanding, but to them, it was an expression of love. But how would you determine if he were really a shameful person or an honorable person who just likes dudes? based on the passive or the passive or the aggressive. If you're the aggressor or the active, I don't need to define this. The active, then it's not homosexuality. If you're the passive, then that means that now you're homosexual, and that's shameful. That makes no sense. Paul is saying, no, it's all homosexuality. It's a sin to God. Now imagine having a congregation in which 50% of the people coming in, they're Greco-Roman with bad habits, and their society is an acceptable behavior. And a woman, if you have a husband, he can sleep around with another woman if she's a slave or a prostitute. It's not adultery. It's only if you sleep with a woman who's married. What woman would like to have that? That makes no sense. Now imagine now the values of the Torah being presented to this Gentile nation with the what do you call it? With the stigma of the Jewish people as being barbarians because they circumcised their children, and swindlers because they were successful businessmen. And now they see the Jewish people living as a family environment. The men, the observant ones, they are being faithful to their wives. They're not sleeping around. They have values of holiness and values of sexuality. And don't you think that's going to create an environment of who are these people? Because the society telling me these people are useless, worthless people, but look how they live. They prosper everywhere they go. They have money. Their wife is happy, and the husband comes to her, doesn't go to anybody else. So these instructions given here in the book of Acts is to create the values that Israel is supposed to have, to be a holy people. We are in this world, but we are not of this world. You will really understand what Yeshua was saying if we really grasp the incredible influence of the Greco-Roman world in the ancient world in every aspect of your life, from the way you thought, it's just like America today, to the way you teach your children. What we're seeing today is how the Greeks and the Romans lived in the first century. That's exactly the same way. You know? It's crazy. I know what's coming. If you read history, I know what's coming. We have a reprieve right now. There's something going on. We better take advantage of it. Okay, because I know what's coming next if we don't change, you know. All right, so when you have Paul's judgment on Gentile morality in Romans chapter 1, verse 18 and 32, finds considerable confirmation in all the sources of the time. Both Jewish and Christian writers agree that the Greco-Roman world was characterized by moral corruption. We know that. So the sex sins were prevailing in the first century. And that crept in the congregation. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 to chapter 8 is all about that. That's why Paul says, don't you know that we're the temple of God? He's not saying that the temple in Jerusalem is already obsolete. He is telling you are behaving in an immoral situation. The Spirit of God cannot dwell within you if you're defiling yourself with idolatry and sexual immorality. Because God cannot dwell in a temple that is immoral. Come on now. But we don't read the text and we don't understand the culture. You've never been to Corinth, so sometimes we are missing the message behind the message. That's why I wanted to go. I wanted to see it. I wanted to learn. When I went into the museum and I saw the Museum of Asclepius, and they had, actually, I'll show you the video a little later when I get to that, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to cover each chapter 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. Each chapter per session. I'm not going to cover it all. And then I'm going to show you a video of where I was so you can see what I saw. When we get to Corinth, you see there was Asclepius, he had a temple, and it was a hospital too, by the way. So therefore what happens is they had, what do you call it? Yeso. It's man, I forgot that word. ¿Alguien que me ayude en español? Yeso. It's a cast. They used to cast that looked like members of the body. Either an arm and an ear, genitalia. By the way, I saw they had a breast in a cast, and I knew that lady had cancer by the way that it looked like. When you study now modern day medicine, you can see if a woman has certain types of cancer, the way it looked like. So the reason was they would take prayers to the god Asclepius, and there they would leave a cast that looked like the part of the body being affected. And they believed that they stay in the hospital. It was like a hotel, really. And then they would just have dreams. They would stay there until Asclepius gave them a dream whether he was going to be healing them or not. That's how they believed it. That's crazy. You learning something already? And by the way, it's so overwhelming that it never ends. I mean, I'm to the point that I'm going, how do I keep up with this information? I can't. So what I'm trying to do is share what I know with you. So when you look into, let me read some verses here real quick. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But I want to contrast this with the time that I have to the Canaanite worship. Now, this is important, okay? First, fertility rituals. In Leviticus chapter 18, verse 1 through 5, this is important that we know. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not carry out the practices of the land of Egypt in which you lived." How many of us study Egyptology and their culture and the way they lived and how they worship and how they did certain things? I mean, the pharaohs married amongst each other, sisters and brothers, to preserve the kingdom. The same thing with the Canaanites. So incest is not permitted in the Bible, so we are not to imitate them. Everything that God gave in the book of Leviticus is contrasting from where they came out of and where they're going, in order to understand what holiness, kedusha. You got to remember, holiness is not restricted only to the Bible. The word holiness is a word that was used widely throughout every religion of the ancient world. They had a definition of what made their religion holy to that God. So they were holy to the Queen Mary, whatever, or the Virgin Mary, or the Vesta Virgins, or the Emperor. They were separated for the worship of that God. So holiness, you need to redefine it. Whose holiness? God's holiness or the nation's definition of holiness? Thus we have syncretism. We assume holiness is the way we wear our clothes from the outer appearance, when in fact, biblically, it's from the inside out. Starts from the heart to the mind to the action. You see, and then everything, when you change, when you convince and you take it to the heart, which is the longest distance from knowledge to repentance. Once you do that, then you begin to behave and change according to what the Spirit of the living God is revealing to you. How is the Spirit of God revealing stuff to you? You never read anything and you just sat there and then poof! That's magic. That's not how the Spirit of God works. We have it all twisted. We assume that the Spirit of God is just going to miraculously just tell you to do things if you never read anything, specifically about the Bible. Yes, amen. You follow what I'm saying? I'm restricting it to these. Now you have to read it. You have to study it. Because if we all really understood it, and by the way, 49,000 denominations think their Spirit of God lead them into every single denomination. So somebody's got to be wrong. Somebody's got to be right. Why don't we go back to the Bible and see that God is right? Not me, not you, not everybody. Let's see what the Lord says. Watch. It says, you must not carry out the practices of the land of Egypt in which you lived. And you must not carry out the practices of the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. And you must not follow their statutes. You must carry out my regulations, and you must observe my statutes and follow them. I am the Lord your God. And I submit to you, you are not to follow the way of the Gentiles and the way the people worship God in any country. The worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob differs in every country you follow. They all have an interpretation of the Bible. And the Bible and the Torah is one. How come there's so many different interpretations? Because we want to mix it. It's our nature. We want to mix everything with our understanding and our cultures to facilitate our needs to survive in that environment. Israel, however, always kept their identity. Yes, and isolating themselves and behaving differently because they will not compromise the holiness that they are to follow according to the treaty and the structure and the oath they took. The problem that we're having, we do not understand what oath-taking really means anymore. We quote the Shema, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, and then we do whatever we want. They don't realize that that's an oath of loyalty to God. The moment you say the Shema, you're no longer a servant of your own accord. Now you are a servant of God, and whatever the king says, you do. And we don't get that. That's what changed me. When I understood these terms, I'm going like, I'm in trouble. I got to get back to basics and start teaching the Bible the right way, because I'm making an oath and then I'm breaking it. Making the oath and breaking it. Okay? So we all go through this. So it tells us not to imitate what the Canaanites do. By the way, remember, when we go through the Bible and you read the scriptures, you know that Israel were captives in Egypt, but yet we don't study Egyptology. They went to the land of Canaan, but yet we have no idea about the Canaanite Baal worship or Baal cycle and the sacrifices and why the new moon and why the full moon, by the way. You do the research and the Ugaritic resources, and you learn really quickly why the temple is all about life and why the Canaanites is all about death and why God hates anything connected with death. Then you'll know why there's no honey in the temple or leaven in the temple. Why is unleavened bread? If you understand the Ugaritic Canaanite worship, you know why God is saying, you're not going to have any of that in my house. It's connected with the apotropaic worship, the underworld gods, not acceptable to the Lord. Right now, we're going in a direction that we quote the Bible, but really, do we understand what we're reading so that we can become better servants? And the whole motivation of this teaching today is for the young guys. It's for you. I'm hoping that I'm going to give you as much information. Forget about them. To be honest with you, I love you all, but let's focus on them. They have so many pressures in this particular environment. They need to understand their faith. They need to know why you need to be loyal to God above anything else. When the world tells you to do this and this, and it appeals to your flesh, you want to know why God says don't do it. It's important why to know that. Because I spent 12 years in the world seeking after my own will because no one took the time to give me the treat me like an adult to teach me. So I owe it to the young people. Because right now in this movement, the older people, we are lost. It's the reality. So what we have here is understanding. Let me read you a little bit about this. General terms of religion marked by rites, okay, which reenact a myth. This is a myth. They all believe this. Accounting for the orderly change of the seasons in the earth of fruitfulness. Can somebody find the book of Genesis chapter 18, verse 14, please? Mike, help me with that. Hopefully, and look at it in your Bibles. I need to see what your Bibles say. I'm going to keep reading. 18:14. It says, such myth often involved a great mother goddess as a symbol of fertility and a male deity. So what's the term that we use today? The Mother Earth. Mother Earth. That's a pagan Astarte type or Asherah type thing. What does Genesis 18:14 says in your version?
Is anything too hard for the Lord? At that time appointed, I will return unto thee according to the time of life.
There you go. According to the time of life. What time of the year is that? The spring. Perfect. So the Bible just told you when Isaac was going to be born. And the Bible just told you when the three angels appeared to Abraham too, in the spring. So why the spring? Why in the spring? Why does our feast begin in the spring? With the sighting of the new moon. Because it comes from the winter. Is anything alive up there? It's a perfect example. So when the spring comes, everything blossoms to every person in the ancient Mesopotamia and also in Canaan and also the Mediterranean. That represented life. Thus, the motif of resurrection from the dead was established. That's why Yeshua died and resurrected in the spring. Because everyone would have understood that. But it tells you the time of life. Many people read it, they never consider that. So then that tells you then why God establishes his feast, specifically in the time of life. Contrasting the time of life that they think that the Canaanites believed was based on fertility ritual. Let me read a little more. Such myth often involved a great mother goddess as a symbol of fertility and a male deity, usually her consort, but sometimes a son. Like the vegetation dies and returns to life again. In Mesopotamia, the divine couple was Ishtar and Tammuz, which is more than Ezekiel 8:14. In Egypt, Isis and her son Osiris. In Asia Minor, Civil and Attis. Asia Minor. Now you know that's Galatia, Ephesus, Sardis, all the churches of Revelation, plus all the main congregations that Paul had. Now, you know, how many of you, please, when I ask this, I'm not trying to make you feel bad. It's just, as a teacher, I'm trying to find out how much I need to expand on the topic. So when I say how many of you have never, it's not like you are less than what I think, not at all. It's just that I need to know if you've covered that so I don't cover. Is that okay? So how many of you have never had an opportunity to study the worship of Civil and Attis? You have not. Okay, so therefore, you're going to be devoid of understanding certain terms that Paul uses that is directly connected to the environment where they live, their main or original religions. Does that make sense? So there's some things he's mentioning that only will be known to the people who worship those gods. Because they have, in the ancient Near East, they had a family gods, they had community gods, and they had national gods. We know this in the story of Jacob with Rachel. She took the gods of Laban, because that used to be the proof of the inheritance for the firstborn son. Because Laban kind of took Jacob and abused him, and Rachel knew he was unfair. The father was taking the gift that he gave her, because in the ancient world, a father would give her a gift to her, as well as the dowry from the groom was going to give her. In case she gets divorced, she has money to survive. Well, guess what? Laban took it all. Now, when he has his sons born, she basically said, well, I'm going to let my father know that he's in trouble. He took the family gods. So how is he going to have the evidence to prove to his firstborn son that he's going to be the one protecting the family? See, that has a lot to do with culture back in the ancient world. I mean, Jacob lived 20 years in Padam Aram. Do we study that area? It's called modern-day Syria, northern Lebanon. We need to understand this. It's interesting. Last night I did the teaching, right? And I saw a comment today on the post. Some really genius said, oh, that's a lot of jumbo mumbo. Why don't you stick with Scripture? I'm going like, wow. So being ignorant and stupid is okay. We don't want to really study the Bible because we may get too smart. So that we can learn to serve God. See the mindset? I don't understand it. Listen, you may not be interested in looking all this stuff up. It's okay. I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to research it, go travel, do whatever, but then don't be criticizing if you're not willing to do it. At least give me a chance to listen to it, validate it. I'll give you the resource. I'll give you all that stuff. And then you look at it and say, wow, I never thought. Thank you, Rico, at least for trying to help us out. And by the way, you don't even have to agree. It is okay. At least just look at it. You have nothing to lose. We have to be quicker to listen and slower to reject. We do that all the time. In Syria, the Ugarit myth of the second millennium BC pictured Baal Hadad, the storm god. Interesting. Now you know why the rain in the time of Elijah. By the way, you're thinking, what is this connected to Acts 15? It's all connected. It's the same problem. Idolatry, fertility rituals, and eating unclean meats, and eating of the blood. You're not supposed to do that. They did this all the time. So therefore, if you go back to the past, you'll understand that throughout what? Watch this. They come out of Egypt, they go back to Canaan. While they're in Canaan, you have the Hittites, the Egyptians fighting against Israel. Then you have later on the Assyrians, and then you have the Babylonians. And then the 10 tribes go to Assyria, they get all lost. And then Judea and the Levites and Benjamin goes to Mesopotamia. In Babylon, now they're conquered by the Persians. And then the Persians now set free some of the Jews to return. But then you have the Macedonian kingdom, the Greeks, and they rush through everybody. And then they defeat the Persians. Now the Parthians take over the power. In the meantime, the Greeks are losing power, and now the Romans are coming up. All of that encases the dispersions of the 10 tribes, the return of the exiles from Babylon, and also the whole gospel period, including the Parthians, who will rule for 500 years from the time before Yeshua, all 200 years, 250 years before Yeshua, up to 245 years after Yeshua, which we never studied the Parthians. And by the way, Acts chapter 2 tells us that there were Elamites, there were Elamites, Parthians, and there were somebody else. I forgot the other one. Babylonians, there in Acts chapter 2. They were mortal enemies. So how did the Parthians get to go to Jerusalem when the delineation of the border of peace between the Romans and the Parthians was actually the Euphrates River? They just happened to have a peace treaty right before the birth of Yeshua, maybe a few years or about a decade or so before that. If it wasn't for that peace treaty, then the gospel would have never really spread throughout the Eastern world, through the Silk Roads, all the way getting to the farthest places of the earth. All of this history has something to do with the message that we're preaching. Did I get your attention? And, and when we learn these things, it only enhances. So now we have the rain. They believe that the rain in the spring was the sperm of Baal. I know it's gross. Deal with it. Because that's what they believe. No one thought it was gross in the time of the Bible. They see the rain. Oh, thank you, Baal, for your rain. And they believe the earth, the Mother Earth, received the rain, and they had a cosmic sex. And the product of that cosmic sex was the fruit of your trees, of your land, of your animals. Everything, right? Check this out. Look at the contrast. Let's read Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 1. I'm going to focus mainly on verses right here. Watch, verse 12. Now, they're going to Canaan, right? He's saying in verse 11, he says, the Lord brought you out with a strong hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. I explained what that meant last night. Okay, so know that the Lord your God, He is God, the trustworthy Elohim, maintaining His covenant, His loyal love with those who love Him and with those who keep His commandments to 1,000 generations. You say you love God, you keep the commandments, you love Him with loyal love. If you don't keep the commandments, you're not showing loyal love. That's how that simple that it is. Young ladies, I'm going to tell you something. Don't listen to the guy who tells you, wow, you're so pretty, I love you. Because every woman can tell you, when you never had anybody tell you that, you get all crazy and you get all, because it's normal. You were created to respond to that. Okay? Watch his actions. If he likes you, he expresses his like for you, where he'll talk to your father and say, sir, can I please have the privilege to talk to your daughter? If he doesn't respect your father, he's not going to respect you. If he doesn't respect his mother, he's not going to respect you. So there are things that are going on here. So watch this. So it says in verse 10, by repaying those who hate him and their own person and to destroy them. Let's move on to verse 12. What verse was that? I thought it was 11. Actually, it's 8. I'm going blind here. It says verse 12. Watch this. And then, because you listen to these regulations and you diligently keep and do them, then the Lord your God will maintain his covenant and his loyal love that he swore to your ancestors. And he will love you, and he will bless you, and he will multiply you, and he will bless the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your soil, your grain, your wine, your olive oil, a newborn calf, and your cattle, your newborn lambs, and your flock in the land that he swore to your ancestors to give you. Now it gets better. You shall be blessed more than all of the people among you. There shall be no sterility or barrenness among the domestic animals. Why is he mentioning all of that stuff? It's exactly opposing the myth of the Canaanite worship, that they believed that it was the sex between, Baal and the Mother Earth that provided the benefit of all. That's why in the Bible you have the redemption of the firstborn. That's why you have the first fruits, bikurim. Everybody argues all the time about it. Every time Passover comes around, I take a deep breath. From the sighting of the moon to the how you do Passover to the counting of the Omer to first fruits, there's not any kind of understanding about what those things mean. It's all about trying to figure out how they work, and yet we don't study the temple that tells you exactly how it works. It's crazy. So instead of getting into the arguments, I just go right to the information. What does it mean? Bikurim, why? Why do you need to bring your first fruits? By the way, if you study the book of Ruth, you'll understand what's going on. She got to Judah, Bethlehem, in the time of the barley, right before Passover. And the whole story ends right by the wheat harvest. It's a quick love. Didn't last 3 months. From the time Boaz saw her to the time he married her. It's only from March until May. Talk about quick. You see what I mean? Based on what? On the harvest. You understand the harvest, then you understand the storyline. It's trying to give you a message. Make sense? So here, the whole motif of the Canaanites is destroyed by who is the one who provides the blessing to everything you have in your land. From your children to your animals, to your fruit, to everything. See, this right here, verse 12, would make perfect sense to a Canaanite. If a Canaanite would have seek after the God of Israel, and now he is trying to bring all the sacrifices to the fertility rituals and all that stuff, and even there was a case that the Moabite, a king of the Moabites, he was having a war. And he was losing that war, and he decided that it was a good idea to sacrifice his firstborn son, the prince, who will rule after him. And he basically sacrificed and killed him in the wall of the city because they believed that if you gave up your firstborn to the god, it guaranteed your fertility thereafter. Maybe that's the reason why the Lord asked Abraham to take his son, his only son whom he loved, to the mountain and put him on the altar and then stopped him. To let him know that the God of Israel will redeem the firstborn. He doesn't need the firstborn to guarantee fertility. And that's the reason after Sarah died, Abraham had a whole bunch of kids. To let us know that the God of Israel doesn't need your life to provide more life. What a message. What a contrast. A righteous king who loves life versus the unrighteous kings who wanted to give the life of your son for selfish reasons, to win a war or to keep your kingdom or to guarantee fertility. I'd rather serve the God of Israel. We need to be grateful for that. Is this making sense? Perfect. Okay, now we understand that there was a whole going on here. Syrian kings derived their names, I'm reading right here, from this deity. His wife was the goddess Adnat. His wife and daughter, by the way. That's Baal. Baal's wife was his daughter. So no wonder it's called ibiti adie. In the scholarly world, they're calling, in the Latin term, imitating your gods. What did Paul say about that? Be imitators of me as I am of the Messiah. Well, imitated how? We don't even know who Paul was. We don't know how he lived. We assume he was a Christian. No, he was a Pharisee according to the law. He said that in Philippians. He was trained a Pharisee. He was a Jew his whole life. How do I know? Because when he went to Rome, he lived in the community that belonged to the Jewish people. I was there, across the river. So therefore, he always hung out with the Jewish people. I'm going to show you something interesting later on when we get to Philippi. And when Lydia got baptized, right? You all know that story when Lydia got baptized. But the text says that he thought, when he went outside the city, he thought that there would be a place for prayer. So he went to the river. I went to that river. I saw it. It's kind of cool. The Bible serves as a GPS too. Because the Bible describes it, and I follow the Bible. It's right there. Right outside, about a few minutes right outside the wall. It's really cool. I found out yesterday as I'm reviewing information that I validated for Thessaloniki, for the Thessalonians, that Josephus tells us that the Jews had a custom in which they always put the synagogues near rivers and near the sea. It was like their escape route for some reason. Now I see why Paul says, so I went to Philippi. He'd never been there before. When he got there, he went to the river because he thought there would be a place for prayer. Because all the Jews put their synagogues either near the river or near the sea. That was their custom. Now that makes sense. And I've been reading that verse forever. And it wasn't until yesterday that I caught on to it in Philippi. I already knew for the Thessalonians because I was there last year. Now I know this is consistent throughout the whole Asia Minor. So all we need to do is find a harbor, and somewhere near the harbor was a synagogue. Find a river, and somewhere near the river was a synagogue. Interesting, right? But you read that text, and you never think about it, because we don't understand the history. So if I was in the first century, and I'm a Jew, and I go from Judea, and I want to go visit my family who lives in Galatia, or lives in Tarsus, or lives in Cappadocia and Bithynia, these are provinces, or lives in Asia Minor and some other congregations, by the way, and all the cities, you have Ephesus, you have Magnesia, you have Laodicea, you have Colossae, you have Hierapolis, Philadelphia, then you have Sardis, then you have Pergamum, and then you have Izmir over here, which Smyrna. It's all basically along the valley all the way around, and you have vineyards everywhere. It's amazing. It's like a postal route all the way around. Then you know what to go for the synagogue. You get to a town, what am I looking for? The river or the sea? There's no sea, there's a river. If there's a river or a body of water, somewhere there's a synagogue. It's kind of cool stuff, at least for me. You go all excited, look at me like I'm crazy about rivers and the sea. His wife was the goddess Anat. In the earliest Ugaritic myth, Asherah, the great mother goddess, was a consort of El. He's the chief god of the pantheon. As Baal replaced El as the major deity, he became associated with Asherah in Judges 6 and 1 Kings 18. Ashtoreth, the daughter of Asherah, is used as the Hebrew word for womb, and the fruit of the womb. Interesting. So in Deuteronomy 7:13 says, and he will love you, and he will bless you, and he will multiply you, and he will bless your fruit of your womb. What a contrast. He is making a contrast between what they believed versus what God is going to do. It's not the womb of that God who's going to give you the fertility. It's I who will bless the womb of the woman in Israel who will do it. Isn't that cool? One of you, hallelujah, praise God. Fertility cults attributed the fertility of the cropland and the herd to the sexual relation of the divine couple. Sexual intercourse by priests and priestesses. Ooh, I'm going to offend some people. Or by cult prostitutes was an act of worship intended to emulate the gods and share in their power of procreation, or else an act of imitative magic by which the gods were compelled to preserve the earthly fertility. We see that in 1 Kings 14:23 and so on and so forth. Now you know why in Israel women were not allowed to be priestesses. So with all due respect, please don't get offended. Okay? But I offend people every day. In the movement, there's a huge argument about priesthoods and stuff. I'm not going to get into the argument. But you have all kinds of women saying, I'm a priestess in the order of Melchizedek. Okay. Tell that to a Canaanite person. They would have thought you were a prostitute. See, we use language without knowing. There's a reason why God restricted the priesthood to the males. Because in the ancient Canaanite religion, it was also temple prostitution with women. Now you have the Aphrodite, the goddess Aphrodite. I climbed that whole thing. Oh, my Lord, that was way up there. Okay? And they had a temple. If you went to that temple, it was not by accident. It was your intent to get freaky up there. And they had women prostitutes and they had temple prostitution, male and female. Paul is dealing with all of that in Corinthians, by the way. He's dealing with all this stuff. I mean, Corinth was actually, the isthmus was actually the center of commerce in the ancient world. If you want to get to Rome, you have to go through Corinth because it's the way to a passage. Because you're not going to go down to the Peloponnese because it was too dangerous with the waves. We know there was a shipwreck, remember? Because you don't go, have you studied the Mediterranean, how to travel and what time to travel in the Mediterranean? It's only limited between March and October. And by the way, the book of Acts tells you. Paul says, do not go anywhere after the fast. Yom Kippur is not safe. And they didn't listen to him and they have a shipwreck because you don't travel after that. And I validated this when I went to Troas and Troy. I went to the museum in Troy, ancient kingdom. And they talked about that. They have some routes, the Mediterranean travel routes. To this day, they're using it, by the way. They're still using the travel routes based on the prevailing winds, even though they have, gas and diesel or whatever. It's interesting. See how much we're missing? It's Acts 15. I'm not in 16 to 19 yet. Well, I'm not going through the itinerary yet. We're just giving you the introduction with the time that I have to compel you to sometimes look deeper into this thing so we know what the message is trying to tell us. When we look into the first century Gospels and we start reading about what's going on in every single one of the cities, then when Paul says some things, now we get it. There's a language he's using. And sometimes we are removed from it and we struggle. So when you go back to the book of Acts, chapter 15, you start reading, now it makes more sense. God told Israel not to imitate what the nations do. Now, the problem here is circumcision for salvation, which we all know we're not saved by circumcision. We are saved by grace through faith. Salvation is a gift. I don't think I have to explain that, okay? Let me move on from that because it's always controversial. Everyone has an opinion, and that's okay and respected, but that's not the topic today. So when we study these things, we need to contrast them with the worship of the Canaanites. We have to. because you see, they lived in the same environment. The contrast between Canaanite fertility rituals and the Israelite temple service reflects broader truth about faith, identity, and morality in the ancient Near Eastern cultures. While Canaanite practices were interconnected with nature and polytheism, the temple service of Israel highlighted a commitment to monotheism, holiness, and a covenantal relationship with a singular God. This distinction has profound implication for self-understanding of the Israelites in their place in a broader ancient world. So now you know that if Israel is going to live in Ephesus, an Israelite in Ephesus, Corinth, Rome, any of these places, they are going to keep their values because they are living in a covenantal relationship with God. And they are bound through covenant to be loyal to God above anything else, regardless of where they're at. And we see that to this day. To this day, you see the Jewish people, they live in communities, they have their synagogues, they have their cemeteries, their schools, they have their teachers, and they do their things, and they have no connection with the outside world. They've gone to an extreme. That's not how it was in the first century. They did have connection, but they preserved their values. They didn't go to the imperial cult. Why? Because they didn't have to. The law supported their freedom to worship in their synagogue. That was removed after the temple was destroyed. And then you have the time of Nero when the persecution of the church occurred. And we forget when we read the book of Revelation that every single one of those letters and every single one of the events in the book of Revelation occurred after the destruction of the temple. 30 years between Nero and Domitian, in which you have all the chaos ensued because the Jews raised up against the Romans, and the Romans are not happy. And now throughout the kingdom, you have the synagogue of Satan. You know what the synagogue of Satan was? We use that so incorrectly today. That has risen anti-Semitism. The synagogue of Satan was Jews who were not believers in Yeshua, but they were following Jewish lives. They had limited rights because of the persecution in the first century, and they were more concerned about their the status quo of their community than creating more issues. We see that in chapter 17 when Paul goes to the Thessalonians. When he's teaching, the Jews who were jealous of him, they go and recruit some people in the marketplace. And I was there in that marketplace. They recruit people in the marketplace to accuse Paul that they're teaching about another king. And the accusation was that they are teaching against the decrees of Caesar. And I will cover that this afternoon or tomorrow. I hope you come back. This is important. So the synagogue of Satan were non-believing. When I say non-believing, I say in Yeshua, okay? They were believers in the Bible, but they were afraid. So now they are turning on the believers in Yeshua as Messiah because they were being perceived by the Roman Empire to be entering treason and sedition. You know what the penalty of sedition was? Look it up. It's actually in this book right here that I hope you consider reading. It's called Criminal Law in Rome, The Criminal Law in Ancient Rome by O.F. Robinson. It's a really good source. Tells you how long treason. I was actually reading about that yesterday on the plane. Sedition. The message of Paul in the Greco-Roman world was a message of anti-imperialism. It was against the emperor. Eventually, he was going to get caught and killed. That's why he did. Because he turned against the empire. He's teaching that there's another Lord, another Kyrios. It's not the emperor, it's Yeshua. He's appointed by God there, and that was a direct affront. And everything was okay if you can say that in your synagogue, but the moment he started recruiting Gentiles, we got problems. Because those Gentiles are bound by oath to serve the gods of the Romans. Because you see, in the ancient world, community and religion was one of the same. Your work and religion was one of the same. The political arena and religion was one of the same. It was not separated. So now you have a Gentile. Let's say you believe in Yeshua as the Messiah, and you're a Gentile. I'm the Jewish guy. So now you got a problem. You need to be accepted into a union or a collegia in order for you to survive. Because guess what? In the first century, if you did not belong to an association, you cannot buy, you cannot sell, you cannot have a job. Because if you belong to the association of the fishermen, then they had a patron goddess. And every month, or they have feasts, or they have sacrifices, and to show your loyalty to that patron goddess, you have to do the same. But now you believe in Yeshua as the Messiah. And he has allowed you to come close to the God of Israel. And you said the Shema. And you actually confess that if Yeshua is your Kyrios, your Lord, and you believe God has raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. You cannot do anything the Romans do now, because they held their oath very much so. We don't know how to do that today. So what are you going to do if you're a Gentile? Now you cannot eat, you cannot buy, you don't have a job, you have no honor, you have no one to protect you. Who are the Jews? They don't want you either, they don't want the Gentiles. How are you going to survive? You can't survive unless you belong to an organization. We never thought about that. I never did. There's a book called Associations in the First Century. Really great book about this. As a matter of fact, it got so bad that in the year 225 of the Common Era, the Romans were having a tough time limiting the Romans to convert to believing in Yeshua. I mean, there was a huge awakening of believing in Yeshua. So they came up with a particular document called the Libellus. It's a document that proved, it was the evidence, and you carry it with you as a passport. When they would ask you if you were loyal to the emperor, you have to show that proof that you gave a sacrifice in imperial worship. If you didn't, you were considered a traitor. If you believe in Yeshua, you cannot do worshiping the emperor. So what if the police ask you, where's your papers? Yes? Interesting, right? How many things have I said that you probably didn't consider? In the study of Acts 15. No, we read it, and we argue about verse 1. Interesting, right? Just wait if you keep coming. It blew me away. I'm telling you, this is my awakening here. This is what I've been studying for the last 5 years, but it wasn't until I went to those places that I said, oh, snap, I got to go back and reevaluate a whole bunch of things. And I've been rectifying certain things that I taught 15 years ago, and I tell people, hey, consider that I've been learning a lot since then. I've been wrong a lot because I didn't take the time to study some of these topics. I'm looking at it from the whole Hebrew roots and Messianic and, Hebrew perspective, when in fact we forgot that the letters were written to real people in a real location with real problems, with real issues, with a dialect, with religion, with customs. We don't know any of those, and we have interpretations. No wonder we're a mess. When I put it in perspective, now when somebody mentions something, I'm going like, but wait a minute, that's not the context. The problem is that I can't have an opinion now. Because if I do, I think I know too much. It's weird. Now education is bad. We try to be a scholar. No, I just want to learn how to serve God better, and I want to share it with you so we can learn together. That's the whole idea. Oh, but I don't have time to do that. Perfect. That's why the Lord gave me the opportunity to do it. I'll go for you. I'll put in the time. I'll share it with you. Just validate it.
Thank you.
And then you're able to live it, right? I said, don't believe me. Let me show you. Look, every time I give you, let me show you this. Watch this. You see this down here? That's the source. This is something that's non-existent amongst our ranks. I could go through all my notes. I'm going to show you a point because my time is almost limited here. But I want to show you. I want you to see it. I put a bibliography. You see? This is a bibliography coming up right there, source. Sourcing things is important. We no longer do that. We just say stuff, and we assume that you have to believe it, and then the attitudes come in. If I don't believe what you say, then now the debates come in. But if we do a peer review, and you study the same information, and then I make a mistake, or I saw, or you say something that I don't know, then I can look it up and validate it. Why does that have to be a threat? When your purpose of a peer review is to make sure that we are accountable because it's going to go to the masses. Where's the peer review amongst us? Anybody today can come up with a whole theory and theologies, and people just run with it. It's not about charisma. It's about truth. We need to adapt to God's truth, not our truth. And we forget that. And sometimes we forget that. So watch this. When we go here to verse 19, and it talks about, we talked about fertility cults. Okay. In the book, The Letters to the Seven Churches of Asia Minor, and their place in the plan of the apocalypse by Horder, by a particular writer, I can't pronounce his name right now. Okay? I'm going to read a little bit here so you see. Hopefully you're enjoying yourself. Thank you. 2 of you. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. I knew I came here to this freezing weather as a Puerto Rican to impact 2 people. I'm just playing with y'all. This was a standard that created hate towards the Jews in Asia Minor and the empire, as William Ramsay explains in his book. Ooh, this guy was amazing. William Ramsay. Now, he wrote in the late 1800s. 1904, he did a book. What he did, he had a weird theology. He studied in England, right? So he didn't really believe in God. So what he does, he picks up the Bible and he goes to Asia Minor. He became an expert in Asia Minor. That was before all the archaeology, by the way. He ended up believing in God. One of the most premier writers, prolific writers, proving the validity of the New Testament. Because everything that he saw, he learned, and it lined up with the Bible. He understood the Bible better. So I'm getting that from him. Therein lay the sting of the case of the Greeks of Holiness. Ooh. Now, you're thinking these are Greeks, right? Or Hellenists. Did you know that term is actually a term that was coined to Hellenized Jews? Timothy's father says his mother was Jewish and his father was a Greek. Look it up in the Greek. It says Hellenist. His father was actually a secular Jew. He was called a Hellenist. Interesting. Said the Jews never merged themselves in the Hellenistic unity. They always remain outside of it. It says, a really alien body. They were outside in a time when patriotism was identified with community or religion. That's what's happening right now, by the way. Okay? Now that we have patriotism back, remember, the freedom of religion is going to explode. People will be more vocal. Okay, it says, it was not possible to attain true unity in those mixed states in the Greco-Roman world. A religious revolution was needed. As to be effective, I must take the direction of elevating thought. Then one great man, when the true prophet's insight, saw that unity could be introduced only by raising the Gentiles to a higher level through their adoption of the Jewish morality and religion. That was going to create a serious problem in the Greco-Roman world that will be the demise of the Jewish people. They're changing the status quo. That's what the Jewish morality and the Torah was doing, changing the whole structure of the whole world. Women will be really happy to serve the God of Israel through Yeshua, because now their husbands need to be faithful. They don't have to put up with the nonsense of the Greco-Roman world and their excuse of sleeping around and be acceptable. That's why the feminist movement came out of Rome, by the way, because of that problem. Women got tired of being stepped on. Okay, but they went way to the left. Anyway. Elsewhere, we have attempted to show the effect of Paul of this idea as it was forced on him on this position at Tarsus, with preeminently the meeting place east and west. I'm trying to give you a little history to get the context here. It follows inevitably from the conditions that there can never be been a case of a single, pay attention to this part, says, it follows inevitably from the conditions that there can never have been a case of a single and solitary Jewish citizen in a Hellenistic city. You could not survive because of the impact of paganism. That's why Paul went to certain places, because there were already communities there. Okay? And the places that there were not places, either they try to kill them or they run them out. Okay? It was impossible for a Jew to face the religious difficulty in an ordinary Greek city. He could not become a member of an ordinary tribe. He could become a member of a Hellenistic city only when the act of some superior power had altered the regular Greek constitution in favor of the Jews as a whole. Like Philip, the king of the Greeks. He gave exemptions for Jews to live amongst the Greeks. That's the only way. Worship your God, eat your food. You're going to have meat sacrifice the proper way. Not sacrifice, but slaughter the proper way in the agora, the marketplace. So you have your kosher meat. By the way, you can send the half shekel to Jerusalem. As long as you do what we do here, you don't have to pay the tax, okay, of the Romans. You can send it to Jerusalem to your God. You can celebrate your feast and your Sabbath in your synagogue. You can meet in your synagogue. You have freedom of religion as long as you don't, mess up with everybody else. Oh, and by the way, you cannot speak against the emperor. We're good. And the Jews like that. After the temple is destroyed, now they have to pay the fiscus judaicus, which is the Jewish tax. The money they used to send to the temple when it was destroyed, now they have to send it to the temple of Jupiter. Now, that's when the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation, you cannot buy or sell, because you have to show your allegiance to the gods of the Romans. That's really the context. Now, the context is restricted to what was going on in the time from Nero to Domitian in the book of Revelation. All those metaphors and symbolism and the historical events occurred during that time frame. But the whole principles of unrighteousness, oppression, persecution, immorality, those things are prevailing throughout the history. That will apply the nuevo. Again, there's going to be another man who will raise up to be a type of an anti-Messiah. Hitler was. The Spanish Empire was. Throughout history, we have the story repeating over and over. And there's going to be a leader raising up like Cyrus. Get it? It's a cycle. It comes over all the time. All that we don't recognize them. And we speculate. Now, Trump is the Antichrist, or next time the rock in the corner will be the Antichrist. We don't have clear how everything works. Did you know that the Jews believed that Nero was going to come from the dead? That Nero, the emperor, who committed suicide after the great fire that he blamed the believers on. He committed suicide, and there was a myth that they believed that Nero was going to go, he went away to the east. He went to the Parthians, and that eventually he will come back and he will restore his kingdom in Rome with greater oppression than he had before. And even the sibling oracles talk about this. Even some of the Jews in the late first century believed that Nero was going to come back and regain because he had a wound in the head. Get it? And there was 5 guys who came back pretending to be Nero. 5 false messiahs. Finally, Domitian was considered to be the false messiah instead of Nero at that time. This will blow your mind, the book of Revelation. By the way, I just so happen to be doing a course on the book of Revelation chapter by chapter. I got 16 hours on the first 7 chapters. Cultural background. Please consider studying that. Okay? Well, I only have about 4 more minutes. But I want to share some of the things. It says, he could become a member of the Hellenistic city only by the act of some superior power, a Greek constitution. It may be set aside as impossible as opposed to all the evidence and reasonable interference, either as an ordinary Hellenic city would voluntarily set aside its own fundamental principles in order to welcome its most hated enemies and most dangerous commercial rivals. They don't like the Jews. Okay? He says, but might not a Jew occasionally desire Hellenistic citizenship for the practical advantage it may offer in trade? He may desire those advantages in some or many cases, but they could not be obtained without a formal admission to a tribe. In other words, if a Jew wants to renounce the identity of Israel, he must now become part of a Hellenistic tribe, meaning they have to have an identity or an association. By rejecting everything, even to the point of reversing their circumcision. There was a surgical procedure called epispasm. It was Jews reverse the circumcision so they can go into the gymnasiums because it's naked men. Interesting, right? That's really wanting to be Greek. Rejecting the sign of the covenant. Crazy. See, this is what Paul was dealing with. He goes to a city, he has to deal with temples, imperial worship of this god, fertility rituals, and then these people will ask him, who are you? Who you serve? Oh, I serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Are you Jewish? Oh, okay, so you're a barbarian. And then he goes to the marketplace, and he was a citizen. Now, you see, that's a quandary. He was a Roman citizen because he was given that privilege when they came back all the way. His family was moved to Tarsus by the Greek Empire, and the Greeks ceded the kingdom to the Romans, so they inherited citizenship. Interesting. So now Paul goes into the Bema. He starts teaching to them in their language about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because he was a citizen. Peter didn't do that. Peter didn't go to any of those places. Why? He couldn't have done it. He was not a Roman citizen. Now we know why. All this, how do you say the term that he used? Todo permitido. Man, I keep forgetting that in English. It's like, all is permissible, but not everything is. What was it again? There you go. All things are permissible, but nothing are profitable. You know what that means? See, in Corinth, and by the way, also in, we saw in another place, I forgot where it was, Thessalonica, 4 minutes. Thessalonica, what they did was, they have the Isthmian Games in Corinth, Isthmian Games, which happen every 2 years. It's like the Olympics. You got the 4 years and then 2 years. Isthmia, I was there. It was a really amazing place in Isthmia. So what they will do, they do games and they do feast. Every Roman citizen had the right to eat of the meat sacrificed to idols. They have cafeterias. If you were a freedman and a slave, you could not do that. But if you were a Roman citizen, you did have the right to partake of meat sacrificed to idols. And you have certain privileges that you could do in the Roman Empire, but Paul is a Roman citizen, but he cannot partake of them. So for him, all those things were permissible, but they were not profitable, because then he will be transgressing the oath of loyalty to God, because he was Torah-believing, living in a completely pagan world, just like we are. So everything's permissible for us, but not everything's profitable. We live in the same environment. But because we are not really tapping into the environment of the first century, we don't see the correlations and the similarities, so we can make a difference. So we opt to do syncretism. We want to be so led by the Spirit that we forget our loyalty to the covenant. Yeah, Christianity is like that. I mean, who's to say who has the right brand of Christianity? I mean, who can determine that? Nobody. In the Christian world, they can. But I sit back and I watch a service. I see how they do certain things, and I'm going like, oh, that goes against that commandment, this commandment, and that one. But in order to know that, you have to learn the commandments. And we don't really study the commandments in detail to understand its legal application and how to do it. So we are always struggling to figure out how to live a life according to the standards of God and His holiness, if we never tap into how He defines holiness. Now you know why I study the temple. Did you know that in the book of Corinthians, Paul is using the Torah portion Kedoshim? It's all about holiness. I found at least minimum 10 commandments within chapter 1 all the way to chapter 10 of Corinthians that are connected, directly or indirectly. How come people don't get that when they read 1 Corinthians? It's always a point of controversy, because we're not connecting it with the source of what he considers holy. Remember, he understood the Middle Eastern mindset. He was born in Tarsus, but he was also studied in Jerusalem, Jewish by birth. Therefore, he understood how they lived. He understood the Canaanite religions. He knew how they live in those areas. He knew the history of Israel in the dispersion, and then also how they lived in the first century. He was part of the problem, remember, when he was persecuting the church. So he had this deep understanding of culture, of language, geography, and topography, that he can really talk at their level, using their own language at times in order to show them who the God of Israel is through Yeshua the Messiah. And that's what we're going to be studying today. In the rest of the topic, chapter 16 comes next. So now you understand that those 3 restrictions that was given to finish up here, after they finish, and they're reminding people, remember that the Torah of Moses is proclaimed in every city in ancient generations, where the Torah is read aloud in the synagogues every Sabbath. He's telling them, these are the 3 minimum requirements to be part of the association of the holy people of God. You cannot behave like the pagan rituals, because God cannot stand syncretism. If you want a part of the kingdom, not a problem. Be part of the kingdom. But your behaviors, there is a moral code that you must start doing. Idolatry, fornication, all these things. And then, as you read the Torah, you have circumcision of the heart. You're going to learn who your Creator is in Genesis. You're going to learn who's your Redeemer in Exodus. You're going to learn who's the one who sanctifies you in Leviticus. You're going to learn who's the one who guides you in the wilderness through your mistakes in the book of Numbers. And then you're going to learn who's the one who's going to restore the covenant with you right before possessing the land. You have to read the Torah, return to the Torah. Let us go back to the commandments and the statutes of the Lord. And I guarantee you, when you read the New Testament, it's going to be a complete different book. And it'll make more sense. We will grow more. And then look what happens after that. And this is something to learn about. This is not done today. And I don't know why. After they all met, the leadership, then it seemed best to the apostles and the others, together with the whole congregation, to send men chosen among them to Antioch, and with Paul and Barnabas, Judas, who is called Barsabas, and Silas, men who were leaders among the brothers, writing this letter to deliver by them. And then the letter is read everywhere they went, validating that Paul is legit, that there's no problem with Paul. Where is that accountability today amongst us? Where is it? Anybody can have a channel on YouTube, teach crazy stuff, create chaos for you. And then you have to fix it while they're over there behind the camera creating chaos. You don't know who he is. You don't know who taught him. You don't know who his teacher. You don't know who he's accountable to. Who keeps us accountable? Think about that, because then we will eliminate a lot of chaos if we help accountability by peer review what we teach, so that you can validate, so you can live, and then you may be able to share, so that we can grow and all we can be in one accord. Amen? May the Lord bless you and keep you guys. Thank you so much.